Okay, and here we are with political participation. How do people participate in the political process in our country? Now, I apologize for not being there. Of course, it'd be a lot easier if I was, but just do know that if you have any questions, make sure that you are asking, emailing, whatever you have to do to make sure that you get what you need to know about participation taken care of. So, first thing, just very quickly, what goes into participation? What does that actually mean for us? And really, who can vote? So, there are some requirements. 18-year-olds, U.S. citizens. You have to be a resident of your state, and then also the big obstacle for most people in our country in terms of what prevents them from voting. They might have some excuses for it and everything like that, but it's because they're not registered. You have to register to vote. And there are some formal requirements or former requirements, literacy tests, poll taxes, that prevented people from voting. Now, you can't be a felon in order to vote in certain areas. Some states are trying to put that kind of behind them, where if you were a felon, you might be able to get the vote back, the franchise back. But as of now, if you're in an institution or if you're in prison, you aren't able to vote. So a quick historical view of voting, and really these are the amendments that you do need to be aware of. Make sure that you're thinking about them because they all kind of give the franchise to more and more populations throughout our history, and they all do quite a lot to increase the democratic process. So at the beginning of the country, right from the beginning, it was white males, almost all of them eventually, towards like the Jacksonian era. That was like the 1820s. Even though he's known for the Trail of Tears with the Native Americans from the South, he extended the vote to a huge chunk of the population. Originally, though, right when the Constitution was written, it was only tax-paying property owners. So that was a huge shift. Not only was it just property owners or taxpayers anymore, but the majority of the population. Now, it wasn't exactly that black people were not able to vote, women were not able to vote, but it was left up to states to decide. So no state was going to allow African Americans to vote. No state was going to allow women to vote. Some states did well before the 19th Amendment, but it was the national amendment process that required it to be mandated to the states. And that is because voting eligibility, what does it take to become a voter within a state, is a reserve power. It is left entirely up to the state. So 15th Amendment was first African Americans. And that was where we put in the stamps of poll taxes and literacy tests, which are things that we have to look closer at in civil rights. But a literacy test was not a can you read test. It was a what do you know about government type test. So number one, you had to be able to read, but then beyond that, you had to know a little bit about history. And it was just a ridiculous expectation for anybody to be able to do that in order to vote, which is why they passed the grandfather clause, allowing the people who had grandparents who were able to vote prior to this law being established. They didn't have to worry about it. Well, that was specifically talking to the white people in the South because African Americans, their grandparents were slaves. The 19th Amendment was next. Now, there were states, again, before the 19th Amendment was ratified that allowed women to vote, but it took an amendment to where it had to be required across the country. 23rd Amendment next, not as big in terms of who was able to vote, but the District of Columbia. The District of Columbia has no representation in the Senate, no representation in the House of Representatives, but they do get 3 electoral votes. Now that 3 is a specific number of 3 because that's the lowest any other state can have, because the electoral votes are based on the number of senators plus reps, while you're guaranteed at least 2 senators plus 1 rep. So that's why DC is stuck at 3, but they were granted that right. Now we move on a little bit more with protections here with the 24th Amendment. That one eliminated poll taxes. The Voting Rights Act combined with that kind of similar era. This was all civil rights with Martin Luther King and the LBJ and the death of JFK. But pushing through civil rights, eliminating poll taxes, took a constitutional amendment. The Voting Rights Act of 65 eliminated literacy tests. Those were 2 pieces of legislation and policy that took those barriers off the black population from being able to vote and really increased the turnout in a lot of ways for the African American population. And really, this is stupid, but the easiest way I remember the two is because they're always grouped together. Voting Rights Act of 65 and the 24th Amendment are grouped together. What I like to do is the 24th Amendment closest to a quarter. A quarter, maybe you have to pay for a poll by paying a quarter, and that means that the 24th Amendment eliminated poll taxes. You do have to figure out some way to keep those two separate, and that's the method that I use. Then lastly is the 26th Amendment. That's the most recent group that has been given the right to vote, which would be 18-year-olds. And that is a lot of time you can keep these amendments separate by the period which way they were ratified. And this one, the 26th Amendment, that was the 70s. People were being drafted. They didn't have a right to vote. So it became a huge push nationally to get the amendment or to get the franchise down to 18-year-olds. And they did. Between a legislative process, the president signed the bill, but right away that was actually ruled unconstitutional, which we're going to come back to in just a moment. So right here, we have looked to increase populations or the population's voting percentages for a long time. And we had a big chunk of our history in the 1800s where population turning out to vote was huge. The percentage of turnout was through the roof. But there are some different historical opinions on why that existed. So just looking at some parts to how we go about increasing voter turnout. So the 1970s, Vietnam, what I was just referring to, the Voting Rights Act of 1970. So it's an addition, like it just continues to add on to the Voting Rights Act of 65 with literacy tests. 70, 18-year-olds could vote. Well, what the problem was is now you have a federal law telling states who can vote in their states. That is a reserved power. Voting eligibility is reserved power. So in a unanimous decision, the Supreme Court said the Voting Rights Act of 70 was unconstitutional. It had nothing to do with them thinking it was a good idea or not. That's not the point. It went against the Constitution. So what they said was it's unconstitutional. It's a reserved power left up to the states, which means if you want to change it, you have to mandate it through an amendment, which got that ball rolling. It took very little time, and then the 26th Amendment was passed for 18-year-olds. Further additions, 1982, this was kind of looking at the immigration that became much more involved in terms of naturalization and the fact that a lot of big hubs of cities had large immigrant populations where maybe the natural spoken language in that area was not English, and the naturalized citizens were not really exposed to English. So they were not able to vote in a way that they thought that they were informed on what they were doing. So the 1982 law made it so that a population had to be represented. You didn't have to prove that they were trying to be discriminatory. The fact that in a Spanish-speaking neighborhood there were only English ballots, and this was actually not Spanish-speaking, but still, it wasn't necessary to prove that they were trying to discriminate against the population. It just had to be a discrimination practice, that something was happening. So they felt like they were being discriminated against, and then now you offer that ballot in non-English speaking areas. Two other pieces of legislation, motor voter law. We talked about that one yesterday. It did have a little bit of an impact, but the idea is people can register to vote when they get their driver's license. Obviously, you have to meet the other boxes, but it did allow a little bit of convenience to the people who were thinking ahead. Not as much in any way that they thought. It was a quick initial, and then it's kind of just been there ever since, but that was the idea behind it. And then also the Help America Vote Act. What they required here was for election equipment to be updated. So if you look at the date here, 2002, get people to feel like their votes count. Don't get them thinking that, well, shoot, if I vote, somebody's just going to screw it up anyway. It's going to have to go through a recount. The chads are going to be hanging off the side, and those little punch holes aren't going to mean anything. Well, this is in large part due to Bush versus Gore. Florida, all of the ballots that were not properly handled and people's votes were thrown out, people stopped trusting it. So they had to do something, and what it did is required everywhere in the country to make sure that people were confident that their vote was handled appropriately and it was going to be counted. So looking at the terminology for what is important when we're looking at the turnout rates, voting age population to registered voters. Now, if you are 18 up, boom, you are in the voting age population, which is basically a huge chunk of the country. Just thinking about it, we have, let's say, 320 million people in the country right now. Well, if you were to look at the percentages of that, you're looking at probably 220 million that are 18 and up. That is a huge voting age population. They aren't all registered. That's not how you have to measure it, because when you look at the voting age population turnout rate, it is extremely low. If you look at the registered voter turnout rate, it's a little bit higher. The voting eligible population, those who are eligible and not felons or mentally incapacitated or anything like that. The registration or the registered voter turnout rate is a little bit higher. If you think about it from a mathematical standpoint, which group is larger? Well, the numerator, the number of voters, is going to be the same. The denominator is going to be different. In this case, the denominator is going to be much larger, which means the percentage is going to be smaller. In this case, the denominator is going to be lower. It's going to be a little bit of a smaller number, so the percentage is going to be higher. This is a little bit more comparable to European countries than the voting age population turnout rate. So we kind of have established now that we know it's not just apathy. People don't vote in this country in a little bit of way because of apathy, but that doesn't solve it. That doesn't really give us a big explanation. It's a little bit more related to registration. Some countries, you're just born into a registration of voting. That doesn't mean that you care. We don't vote compared to other areas, and the turnout has been going down. So why is it that our turnout has been going down? Well, two different theories. Number one, people are just having trouble getting there. They're having trouble getting to the registration. They're having trouble getting to the polling booth. And people have just continued to lose their faith in the government system. There are a lot of people talking currently about like the Bernie Sanders, Hillary Clinton, and the Feel the Burn movement, and how millennials are just so frustrated with the government system. They feel like they're let down by all this American dream talk, and then they leave college with thousands of dollars of debt, and they feel like the government let them down. So they try to distance themselves. And that might mean then that some feel like their vote really isn't a part of what they feel, what they are represented by. So this is a real decline. People are actually, in terms of a percentage, having less say over the last 100 years. The other one, though, the one that's a little bit more interesting, is that it doesn't really have a decline. It's only apparent because things were shady. There was corruption like you have never seen before. It was, think of anything that you might picture with the 1800s and voting and manipulation, and it probably happened. Number one, the political parties were the ones who once printed what the ballots looked like. So if you think about that, that would mean that the people in control right now, which in Congress would be the Republicans, they could print a ballot, make Donald Trump's name huge, Hillary Clinton's small, and then figure out who's going to vote for what. If somebody goes and they really don't care, boom, it just can be manipulated to make your candidate win. They're also in public. So here you go. Who do you vote for? Oh, really? You're going to vote for that person? I don't think so. And it's just a shady gig. It doesn't really make sense. The political parties counted. I mean, there was some both sides to it, but if we're thinking about the biggest group was Tammany Hall when it came to this in New York City. And there were some opposing parties there, but they controlled the counting. And there were, so just speaking of this, Tammany Hall, they were a political machine. They controlled everything that went down. Look, don't get me wrong. They got people to do what they wanted by carrying out the bribes. So, hey, if you vote for us, we'll make sure that all Irish immigrants are protected or all Italians are protected. And they would protect them. But it was a pretty brutal way of doing it. But it made it so the turnout rates were extremely high. And in some areas, the turnout rates were more than 100%. That's just, I don't understand why it took so long to discover that there was such corruption going on. Finally, what they did, though, is they took and they made it, boom, here's the president. These are your two options. And then they would alternate based on the different party. And it's just more basic, more standardized, no favoritism. and they couldn't make the claim then that political parties were controlling it anymore because it was so standard. But this is a quick clip from Gangs of New York. If you've seen this before, it's on election day, and I think it's kind of a good representation of election day and election manipulation. I think it's kind of an odd movie, but
all right, line them up. It's election day. Okay, come on, you bastard. We need to vote. Bastard. I lost an arm for you. Well, that's a start. Now, come on. Rise and shine. Rise and shine. This great country of ours, even the hop fiends get the
so as they're going through, they're picking everybody they can to be able to vote.
I already voted today. Cast for Monk and Tamanade, I got. Twice. Only twice. You call that doing your civic duty?
Civic duty, there we go. Political culture. And here we go, changing faces. This is why it's so easy to manipulate the system. That right there, while it's from a movie related to Tammany Hall, it's how it happened. I mean, that is the way that we looked at the population and how the manipulation occurred. So now it's not exactly the same. Does manipulation happen? Yeah. Every once in a while you see movies where the corruption happens and they get different fraud and different people to be able to vote, but it's not anything that I put any serious weight into. And yeah, I get it that we don't really vote as much, but people participate. It's something that we talked about in our culture. We are unified. We are all American, and we support that. So there are different things that we do to participate. We don't have to vote just to participate in government. A lot of other countries, once they vote, they're done. They don't care about if their representative does what they want. They don't care if they don't like the policy to go right anybody and complain. We do. We see it all the time, and it's a part of our culture where we feel like we have the right to do that. Civic duty, that's there. We do join different groups, interest groups, whatever. We write congressmen. We can watch the news. You're participating by watching the debates all the time. We protest in front of City Hall. People participate all the time, not just through voting. Participation is most widely talked about when it comes to voting, but it's not just voting. And while we have all of these different positions to vote for, we still don't have a perfect system. And when we vote, you would hope that people know a little bit about every position, but it doesn't really look like that. And a good example is going to be happening with November. We're going to have a huge turnout. It's a presidential election, but I mean, I bet if you were to ask the people, take a poll of people and ask them who they're actually voting for when it comes to the state rep, the House senator, the state senator, the state rep, and the U.S. House of Representatives. Ask them who they're voting for. See if they know any of the candidates. And a big problem with that to me is that in a lot of ways, those positions are more important to you on a policy level than the president. But it's so covered by the media that it's difficult to get that through to people that those positions are equally, if not more important than who the president is. So now let's take a look at the people who don't vote. Like I just said, the people who only know about the president. Why is it that people don't vote? We have a lot of reasons. Registration, but you can't just say registration because there has to be some explanation with the registration for why people don't vote. So I'm glad that you guys are all curious, so let's take a look at it. Some people just can't. Now, if you were to take a look at all of these, you might buy some, but they're figures that occur. So 100,000 don't vote for religious reasons. Some people just don't feel like a representative in their government is appropriate. Now, that number is relatively small, and it's not any of the major religions that you would be familiar, but it occurs. That's the point that you have to remember. 500 in a million have been qualified as unable to because of their lack of franchise by being a felon or mentally unfit, mentally ill. 5 to 6 million become ill quickly. I talked to Seventh Hour about my grandma, and it's not a matter of being ill to where you can't get there and then we need to find a solution. It's this person's not doing well and they don't think to do a absentee ballot, or it just kind of piles up piece by piece around the country, like individual person, individual person, individual person, individual person. Then before you know it, we get to the point where a lot of people just don't get there because they don't have the opportunity to vote. And absentee ballots aren't easy. I mean, they're not hard either. I'm not trying to say that they are. I told you that I did that with my first election in 2004, but they're not easy. It's an inconvenience on both sides, and I think it's kind of an attempt to prevent fraud with it as well. And then 2 to 3 million, those people travel suddenly. Business people, if you're out of your area on business trips, I know both my brothers that it's just a flip of the coin, really. If they're home from Monday through Friday, probably 2/3 of the time they're not at home. They have to be gone on their business trips, and if they don't schedule it right, or if they don't have an absentee ballot, they don't get to vote. And it's the business world really kind of operates in that manner, where it's just a matter of who schedules a meeting and where do they schedule it. So now there are a lot that are left. So what fits their explanation? Why aren't they going to the polls? And here we go. First, time zone fallout. Now, time zone fallout is not really an issue for us because we're the first ones. We're on the East Coast. The sun goes west. So we are on the East Coast. We play a role in the time zone fallout. And it is a real thing. It's not, it often is a little misguided in terms of how people can view it. But as soon as the polls close on the East Coast, Wolf Blitzer, CNN, whatever, is going to get out and say, we feel confident enough to predict that Maryland is going to Hillary Clinton and Georgia is going to Donald Trump. And they make those predictions at 8 o'clock. That means it's only 5 o'clock on the West Coast. That is a big deal. And people will either go, or more likely they won't go because they see what's happening on the East Coast and they feel like their vote is even less important when it comes to the outcome of the election. Too complicated. Their vote doesn't matter. This all comes down to efficacy. I mean, the more you know about it, the more you realize your vote absolutely matters. I don't care what the outcome is. That is the whole point in a process where a democratic system works. Your vote does matter. And if it's too complicated, I don't understand what is complicated. The registration process. You go to a room, they hand you a ballot, and you fill in a bubble. Figure it out. But lack of interest. This isn't really something that you're going to fix right away. People don't care. I mean, they don't care. They don't think politics matter. And that cynical view on life, it just perpetuates a cycle where we don't get to fix the problem by attacking it with a solution. And if you're just going to sit idle and go about it and then just complain and complain and complain, you're only going to bring people down. It's not the way to go about life in anything, just to complain and say it doesn't matter, but it doesn't matter, it doesn't matter. It does matter. And it matters in a lot of ways, and that's what I think people that we communicate with, and I mean this as our class, we communicate with. I think you see the impact of it today in the debates and the elections on a local scale as well as the presidential. Your voice does matter. But I do want to show you this clip related to time zone fallout. I think this is a pretty funny clip. This is from Head of State. It's got Chris Rock running for president, and they are the opponent, and they're trying to figure out how can we get some votes back. We're losing on the East Coast. Chris Rock is going to be president. How can we prevent those West Coast voters from feeling like their vote doesn't matter anymore because the polls on the East Coast are already closed, so how can we get them to vote on the West Coast?
Get California, you get the election. It'll make the 6:30 news if we do it now. We just have to put it out there. Can we do this? The government can do anything.
The race for president now turns to the West Coast.
People, Armageddon is upon us, and Big Dave is
If
scared.
the current voting trends sustain, it appears likely that for the first time in our history, a black man will become president of the United States of America.
1, 2, 3. Yeah, it's not national. Underground, underground, and I stop the ground. Like a millionaire, I've been the silver back. No rain, you can't stop the train. You want some, don't come, no feet there. I'll be there, but when I leave there, better be a hustle name. Other man telling us that it gon' rain. So have to sit in the drop top, so you wait.
So I think that's just kind of funny as a reverse time zone fallout where they scare everybody in the suburbs of California to think that somebody who's black is going to be president, so they come vote. And Chris Rock still succeeds. But anyway, looking at the other part of our chapter really is the percentages. This is the information that you looked at the other day. So you have race. Race is a factor. But these are often more tied to education and income than anything else. So white people do tend to vote more than African Americans, but African Americans are extremely loyal. And once you remove race, once you remove wealth and education, they're even. So it's difficult to say that white people vote more than African Americans in terms of a number, yeah, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about percentages, percentage of whites to percentage of African Americans. If you eliminate the gap in income between the two and in education, they're actually a little bit more on par with each other. Education is by far the biggest. Churchgoers do vote more, and then men and women. The gender gap. There is no gender gap with voting. That's the same rate, but these are the figures that we look at from a census and say who votes and kind of use that data from any angle to figure out how you can win the next election. Okay, so what is it then that people can do? You know, can anything really be done to increase the turnout? And the answer is not really a yes. Can anything be done? It's yes, I guess. But really, it's not just a yes. There are so many issues that go into it. Registration barriers continue to be an issue. So I talked to you about Florida and how the floods, they wanted to cut off the registration. That's a barrier. Voter there are problems at voting booths. People go in a lot of states. You have to have a photo ID, and if you think about a photo identification law, I feel like in a lot of ways it makes sense. But we talked about this in seventh hour, where every time you get an ID, you have to pay for it. And while that seems like, the $15 or whatever it is, that isn't a lot of money when you're thinking about it from getting a driver's license, somebody who just wants to vote, doesn't want a license, $15 is kind of a poll. It's a poll tax. So those are the type of laws that people have problems with. And I'm not saying that it's right or wrong. I think photo IDs are a necessary component to prevent fraud, but still, are there people that aren't able to vote because of them? And I think the answer is yes to that. I don't think there's a good solution, which is why I guess I don't know what we can do to necessarily increase voter turnout. But I do think it's important to keep trying. Keep trying. The Motor Voter Act, I don't care if it went up 0.2%. It's worth it if more people continue to vote. So really, getting people to understand, sharing the civic duty that people have, and civic competence, knowing what you can do to change government, and the fact that you have an investment in the outcome. Now, I really think it's important when we look at elections, and we focus more on elections in a few weeks, like specific about elections, not just voting, but it can make a difference to where people feel like the outcome can impact them in a positive way. Come on, let's go. I think we just got stuck. Well, okay, so make sure that you understand what goes into a vote. And I don't mean your knowledge going into a vote, but what the outcome can actually mean. Because while we are in a country where the gap in the popular vote is probably going to be about 4 to 5%, the millions of voters within each state, most states are going to be not in the even hundreds of thousands in terms of a gap. Your vote matters because of what it stands for more than anything else. If you care, you will figure out a way to vote. And the best way to figure out a way to get people to care is to talk about what happens. That means just discuss. And that's a part of participation, discussion. Talk with somebody, watch the news, follow the debates, and in some way, maybe we as a class or you as a generation will figure out a way to encourage those percentages to go up and get everybody in this country involved in voting. Make sure you're asking questions if you have them. Make sure you email me them if you have them.